In a land where the sun burned like a preacher's glare and even the buzzards seemed to be keeping minutes for some final judgment, Jedediah Boone found himself staring at a girl hanging from a cottonwood tree. She dangled there like a grim warning left too long in the wind, a wooden placard nailed to her chest. "White man won't forgive." Jed sat still in the saddle, his horse uneasy beneath him. He had seen cruelty wear many costumes in Ash Hollow, but this spectacle felt too theatrical, too pointed, as if the whole prairie itself wanted him to take notice. Jed was 34 years old, though his bones often told him he was older. He lived alone on a spread of land where the cattle numbered more than friends, and the only judgment he trusted came from the weather. He had a face carved by sun and silence, eyes that unnerved townsfolk because they rarely betrayed thought. Clara Mayfield once told him he had the sort of stillness that made her feel watched by the Almighty. He had offered marriage to her in younger days, only to be refused with a softness sharper than a knife. She wanted someone who would build a church pew with her, not a man who would vanish into the horizon like dust. Since then, Jed had settled into the role of a man half forgotten. He dismounted. The girl was young, no more than 22, her skin painted by the earth, her braids roughened by wind and rope. She wasn't dead. The rise and fall of her chest was shallow but steady. Jed cursed under his breath, cut her down with a quick slice of his knife, and caught her in his arms before she touched the date. Whoever left her here had meant to shame, not kill. Still, shame could wound deeper than any bullet. He laid her gently on the ground, his shadow stretching across her like a cloak. She stirred but did not wake. Jed looked at the sign lying beside her. The words still burned into his eyes. He thought, for one dangerous moment, about what life would look like if he didn't ride away. The prairie wind hissed its warning. Trouble, gossip, ruin. But loneliness is louder than any wind. He took her with him. Days bled into one another at the Boone Ranch. Jed kept her in the small room at the back of the house, the one that smelled faintly of cedar and disuse. She woke slowly, mistrusting the bread and water he offered, her dark eyes sharp, calculating. She would not speak, but she would eat, and that was a start. Her silence pressed on him, but it did not repel him. It steadied him, reminded him that company did not need noise. Her name came to him one night, whispered through fever as if she had no intention of letting him hear. Ahioka. She brought happiness. A cruel twist of fate, perhaps, but Jed thought the name fit her even if her face carried more storm than sunlight. He began teaching her words in English, pointing at the horse, the bucket, the sky. She, in turn, offered him her words, laughing softly when he fumbled the syllables. The first time she laughed, Jed felt the air in the room shift. The silence no longer weighed on him. It hummed. Ash Hollow did not hum. It hissed. A drifter saw Jed buying medicine and whispered to the wrong ears. Soon enough the town had its entertainment. Boone's got himself a squaw stashed away. The saloon men chuckled into their whiskey. Clara Mayfield shook her head in pity, and the sheriff delivered his warning with a sigh. "You do well not to stir the pot, Boone. Folks don't forgive easily out here. You know that." Jed only nodded. He'd learned long ago that words could betray more than they protected. Still, the shame found its way to him. When he returned from town, carrying the weight of their judgment, he found Ahioka mending his shirt where the cuff had torn. Her hands moved quick and sure, her head bent to the work. She didn't look at him, didn't smile, didn't offer thanks for his silence. But the act itself steadied him more than any sermon could. In her refusal to name it, grace lived. And yet, grace is fragile. One night, Jed woke to find the fences slashed, the water trough poisoned. He knew the message, plain as if they'd carved it into his barn door. "We will not forgive." Ahioka packed her few things at dawn, her movements precise, efficient. She believed leaving was the only shield she could offer him. Jed leaned in the doorway, watching her, his voice calm and level when he finally spoke. "Don't give them what they want." She froze, her back to him. He feared then, not the town's cruelty, not the poison in his water, but the yawning emptiness if she walked away. For the first time in years, he felt loneliness not as a dull ache but as a wound gaping wide. He said nothing more. Protocol kept his tongue still, but his eyes carried the plea. She stayed. For now, the decision to stop hiding came quietly. Jed woke one morning, saddled his horse, and gestured for her to ride with him. They entered Ash Hollow together, Ahioka's face unflinching though the townsfolk gawked as though they'd seen blasphemy riding in on horseback. Whispers slithered through the streets. Clara stood outside the general store, her pity sharpening into something Jed couldn't quite name. The sheriff spat into the dirt. Jed dismounted, tied his reins, and offered Ahioka his hand. She took it. Together they walked into the church. The air inside smelled of pine and dust. The pews half empty, but the silence brimmed full. Jed faced the preacher, his voice calm, eerie in its stillness. "I aim to marry her." The preacher stammered, eyes darting to the sheriff, to the congregation gathering at the doorway. No one moved. The silence felt heavier than bullets, thicker than judgment. Jed's stillness, his refusal to tremble, unsettled them more than if he'd shouted. Beside him, Ahioka's hand tightened around his, her first gesture of trust, and that simple grip carried more weight than all the town's disapproval. The preacher, trembling, performed the ceremony in clipped words. Not out of faith, not out of joy, but because refusing felt more dangerous than bending. When it was done, Jed and Ahioka walked out into the bright, pitiless sunlight. The whispers did not die, the stays did not soften, but neither did anyone raise a hand. Clara watched from the crowd, her pity now a strange envy. The sheriff muttered to let them be. For once, Ash Hollow had no appetite for escalation. They had wanted scandal, not quiet defiance. Jed and Ahioka gave them the opposite, and somehow that made them untouchable. Back at the ranch, the dusk spilled purple across the prairie. They sat on the porch together, sharing bread the way they had at the beginning. Only now there was a quiet smile between them, a mutual recognition that survival had become something gentler, something resembling love. Jed's thoughts unfolded slow and deliberate, a prayer not to God but to the land itself. Maybe love was never meant to be fire and thunder. Maybe it was bread passed between tired hands, silence shared under one sky, the decision to stay when leaving would have been easier. Out here, where the wind carried more judgment than hymns, that was enough. That was more than most ever got. So if you ride through Ash Hollow and hear the gossip about the rancher and the Apache girl, tip your hat. Not for the scandal, but for the quiet miracle of two forsaken souls who dared to forgive the world by choosing each other. Life don't always deal you a winning hand, friend, but play it honest, and you'll find grace in the losing. And sometimes, the smallest act of staying becomes the loudest kind of love.